Number 1. Clare Miller. She was just 14 years old, living in a quiet suburban home in Pennsylvania, when her name would suddenly dominate national headlines. Neighbors described her as a cheerful, polite teenager, someone who had never shown signs of violent behavior. But in February of 2021, a call to 911 from inside her family's home would reveal a crime so shocking that many found it almost impossible to believe a child could carry it out. Clare Miller grew up in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in what seemed like a normal household. Her parents were attentive, her family was active in the community, and her life, at least from the outside, looked typical of many suburban teens. But there was one important detail about her family dynamic. She had an older sister named Helen, who was 19 years old and living with cerebral palsy. Helen used a wheelchair and required specialized care every day. Friends and neighbors knew the family as deeply devoted, always making sure Helen had what she needed. Nothing suggested any turmoil that might lead to tragedy. In the early morning hours of February the 22nd, 2021, Clare made a startling move. Just after 1 a.m., she picked up her phone and dialed 911. On the line, she confessed something that immediately alarmed dispatchers. Police arrived within minutes and were met by the sight of Clare waiting outside the family's home, still in her pajamas. She repeated what she had done, guiding officers into the house. Inside Helen's bedroom, officers found her unresponsive. Clare told them she had attacked her sister while she slept. Emergency responders attempted to revive Helen, but it was too late. The teen, who had been known for her quiet, ordinary demeanor, was suddenly being placed in handcuffs on her own front lawn. The crime shocked the nation, and the investigation quickly tried to uncover why it had happened. Authorities searched for any signs of abuse or mistreatment in the home, but none were found. Clare did not offer a clear explanation, and police revealed that she seemed distraught and emotional during questioning. Detectives noted the crime did not appear to be premeditated in the traditional sense, but the fact remained. She had intentionally taken her sister's life. Because of her age, the legal process became complicated. In Pennsylvania, juveniles accused of homicide are typically charged as adults. Within days, Clare was facing adult murder charges, despite being just 14 years old. At her first court appearances, cameras captured her small frame entering the courthouse, her hands shackled as reporters shouted questions about why she did it. She gave no answers. Defense attorneys argued that her age, her mental state, and the circumstances of the family environment should allow her case to be moved to juvenile court. Prosecutors countered that the seriousness of the crime demanded an adult trial. Court documents revealed that Clare had no prior criminal history, no documented pattern of violence, and no obvious warning signs. Yet prosecutors emphasized the deliberate nature of the act and the need for accountability. The case sparked widespread debate in the community. Many felt sympathy for the Miller family, who not only lost their disabled daughter, but also had to grapple with their younger child being accused of the crime. Others were deeply unsettled, asking how someone so young could commit such an act against their own sibling. News outlets across the country covered each development, often highlighting the heartbreaking photos of Helen smiling in her wheelchair, juxtaposed with mugshots of Clare looking stunned and tearful. As the legal process moved forward, questions of mental health took center stage. Reports suggested that Clare struggled with anxiety and depression, though the full extent of her state of mind was never publicly detailed. Evaluations were ordered to determine her competency to stand trial, and experts were called to weigh in on whether juvenile facilities or adult facilities prison would be the appropriate setting if she were convicted. Because of her age, the legal process was complicated, but it ultimately reached a conclusion. In March of 2023, Clare Miller pled guilty but mentally ill to third-degree murder in the death of her sister Helen. Judge David Workman sentenced her to 12.5 to 40 years in prison. She was also ordered to continue receiving mental health treatment while incarcerated. The sentencing ended 2 years of court battles over whether she should be tried as a juvenile or as an adult. Prosecutors emphasized the seriousness of the crime, while her defense pointed to her struggles with mental illness. In the end, the court ruled that accountability and treatment had to go hand in hand. The fallout in Lancaster County was profound. Families wrestled with how a 14-year-old could take the life of her disabled sister, while advocates for people with disabilities mourned Helen and stressed the vulnerability of those who depend on loved ones for care. The case also reignited national debate over how juveniles who commit serious crimes should be punished, especially when mental illness plays a role. Clare Miller is now serving her sentence in a state prison, with the possibility of release in her 30s or 40s. Her case remains a tragic reminder that behind the most ordinary suburban doors, unthinkable acts can unfold, and that the line between childhood and accountability can be devastatingly thin. Number 2, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier. It began as what appeared to be an ordinary sleepover among 3 12-year-old girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin. They had been friends for years, bonding over school, games, and the kind of small world dramas that fill the lives of preteens. But on the morning of May 31st, 2014, something unthinkable happened. 2 of those girls would lead the third into the woods, and what followed would become one of the most infamous cases of youth crime in modern America. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier were both 12 at the time, classmates who shared an intense imagination and a fascination with internet folklore. One figure in particular gripped their attention: Slender Man, a fictional, faceless character born from online forums and photoshopped images. While most kids understood Slender Man as just a story, Morgan and Anissa began to treat him as something more. They came to believe that proving loyalty to this character required a sacrifice, and in their minds, that sacrifice was going to be their best friend, Peyton Leutner. The weekend began with laughter, pizza, and roller skating. Peyton, Morgan, and Anissa spent the night at Morgan's house. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the next morning, the 2 girls put their plan into motion. They convinced Peyton to come with them to a nearby park. From there, they led her deeper into a wooded area. Once out of sight, Morgan pulled out a kitchen knife she had brought from home. Together, Morgan and Anissa attacked, stabbing Peyton 19 times. Incredibly, Peyton survived. Bleeding and weak, she managed to crawl to the edge of the woods where a passing cyclist spotted her and called for help. Emergency responders rushed her to a hospital, where surgeons later said that 2 of the stab wounds had narrowly missed vital organs, including her heart. Without quick medical intervention, she would have died. The investigation moved swiftly. Police soon found Morgan and Anissa walking along a highway. When questioned, the girls calmly explained what they had done. They told detectives that they believed Slender Man lived in a mansion in the forest, and that by killing their friend, they would become his proxies. Their statements stunned seasoned officers. These were not teenagers hardened by years of violence or crime. These were 6th graders who had allowed a piece of internet fiction to consume their reality. Because of the severity of the crime, both girls were charged as adults, despite being only 12. That decision sparked a heated debate. Some argued that their age and psychological state made them prime candidates for treatment rather than punishment. Others insisted that the brutality of the act demanded an adult trial's accountability. The legal process revealed important details about their mental health. Morgan was eventually diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia and found to have delusional beliefs. Her attorneys argued that she was incapable of distinguishing fantasy from reality at the time of the attack. Anissa, while not diagnosed with the same disorder, was shown to have been deeply influenced by Morgan's dominant personality and the shared obsession with Slender Man. In 2017, both girls accepted plea deals that spared them traditional prison sentences. Anissa was sentenced to 25 years in a mental health facility, while Morgan received a sentence of 40 years of treatment in a secure psychiatric hospital. Judges emphasized that both would undergo regular evaluations with the possibility of release if they were ever deemed safe for society. The outcome was controversial. Some believed justice was served, pointing to their young age and mental health challenges. Others argued that the sentences were too lenient, considering the premeditated nature of the crime and the trauma suffered by Peyton. Meanwhile, Peyton herself endured a long recovery, both physically and emotionally. She later spoke about the difficulty of processing what had happened, that the people she trusted most had turned on her in such a violent way. The case gained worldwide media coverage, not only because of its shocking details, but also because it highlighted the influence of internet culture on impressionable young minds. Slender Man had begun as a simple online story, never intended to inspire real violence. But in the hands of two young girls, it became a distorted reality with devastating consequences. Parents, educators, and mental health professionals all weighed in, calling for greater awareness of how children interact with digital worlds and how fantasy can blur dangerously into reality. Today, the names Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier remain tied to one of the most haunting examples of juvenile crime in America. Their case forces us to ask unsettling questions. How much responsibility can a child bear for a crime when mental illness and imagination are at play? And how do you balance justice for a victim with the potential for rehabilitation of an offender who is still just a child? In the end, the story of the Slender Man stabbing is not only about violence, but about the vulnerability of youth, the power of belief, and the thin line between fiction and reality. It is a case that continues to be studied, not only by the courts, but by anyone trying to understand how something so unreal could lead to something so tragically real. Number 3. Josh Phillips. On the surface, he was just another teenager in Jacksonville, Florida, living in a quiet neighborhood where children rode bikes in the streets and parents felt safe letting their kids play outside. But in November of 1998, when 14-year-old Josh Phillips was left home alone for the day, he would commit an act so disturbing that it stunned his community and made international headlines. Josh lived with his parents in a modest suburban home. His father, Steve, was known as a strict disciplinarian who kept close control over the household. Josh, by contrast, was seen by neighbors as a quiet boy who loved video games and baseball. He was an only child, and to most who knew him, he seemed like a typical teenager, but his relationship with his father was tense. Friends later said Josh was terrified of getting into trouble, especially when it came to breaking household rules. On November 3rd, 1998, Josh was home alone after school. His parents were both at work. That afternoon, his 8-year-old neighbor, Maddie Clifton, came by looking for someone to play with. Maddie was energetic and well-liked, the kind of child always seen outside with a ball or bike. She and Josh knew each other casually, and on that day, she asked if he wanted to play baseball. Josh agreed. They went into his yard, but at some point, the ball accidentally struck Maddie in the eye, causing her to cry. This was the moment everything spiraled. According to Josh's later statements, he panicked. He feared his father would come home, hear Maddie crying, and punish him for having someone over without permission. In a rash decision, he dragged Maddie inside the house. Instead of calling for help or walking her home, he hit her again to quiet her. In the chaos, he escalated his attack until she was fatally injured. Now faced with the reality of what he had done, Josh did something almost unthinkable. He hid Maddie's body under the waterbed in his bedroom. For the next week, as a massive search for Maddie gripped the neighborhood. Her body remained just feet away from where Josh slept each night. The disappearance of Maddie Clifton drew enormous attention. Hundreds of volunteers searched the streets while police questioned neighbors and family members. The community, normally safe and tight-knit, was consumed with fear. Flyers with Maddie's picture were posted on every corner. News outlets covered the search daily, and Josh even joined in the search efforts with other neighbors, giving no hint of what he was hiding inside his home. The discovery came almost by accident. A week after Maddie went missing, Josh's mother, Melissa Phillips, went into his room to clean. While making his bed, she noticed a strange leak coming from the waterbed. Alarmed, she looked underneath and made the horrifying discovery. She immediately called police. Officers rushed to the home, and within hours, Josh was arrested. The shock was overwhelming. Parents in the neighborhood could hardly comprehend that a 14-year-old boy, someone they had seen grow up, had committed such a crime against an 8-year-old girl they all adored. The media swarmed Jacksonville, and the case was quickly broadcast across the country. Because of the severity of the crime, Josh was charged as an adult with first-degree murder. His trial began in 1999. The defense argued that the killing had not been premeditated, that it was the tragic result of a scared child making a series of terrible decisions under pressure from an abusive home environment. They claimed Josh's fear of his father's reaction had driven him to act irrationally. The prosecution painted a different picture. They pointed to the brutality of the attack and the fact that Josh had hidden Maddie's body for days, even participating in the search while knowing exactly where she was. To them, it was evidence not of panic, but of calculated concealment. In July of 1999, after a high-profile trial, the jury found Josh Phillips guilty of first-degree murder. Because he was charged as an adult, the mandatory sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. At just 15 years old, Josh entered the adult prison system, where he remains today. The case continued to spark debate for years afterward. Many questioned whether a teenager should spend his entire life in prison for a crime committed at 14. Others argued that the brutality of the act left no room for leniency. In later years, Josh's attorneys filed appeals, citing his age at the time of the crime. In 2017, following U.S. Supreme Court rulings that limited life without parole sentences for juveniles, Josh was granted a resentencing hearing. The court reduced his sentence to life, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. That means he will be eligible to apply for release in the mid-2020s, though there is no guarantee he will be granted freedom. The public fallout from the case was massive. It highlighted both the vulnerability of children like Maddie and the troubling questions about how the justice system should handle young offenders who commit violent crimes. Parents in Jacksonville still remember the fear and heartbreak of that week-long search. And for many, the image of a young boy hiding such a terrible secret beneath his bed remains one of the most haunting details in American true crime. Today, Josh Phillips sits in prison, his case often used as an example in discussions about juvenile sentencing reform. Maddie Clifton's family continues to grieve, their daughter remembered as a bright, playful child whose life was cut short. The story leaves behind a lingering question. How much weight should we give to age and fear when a child commits the unthinkable? Number 4. Rachel Shoaf and Shelia Eddy. On the night of July 6th, 2012, in the small town of Star City, West Virginia, 16-year-old Skylar Neese climbed out of her bedroom window for what her parents assumed was a harmless late-night outing with friends. Skylar was bright, friendly, and ambitious, with dreams of becoming a criminal lawyer one day. But by the next morning, she was missing. What began as a search for a runaway teen soon revealed a darker truth. Her two best friends, Rachel Shoaf and Shelia Eddy, had planned her death for months. Skylar, Rachel, and Shelia were inseparable. They went to high school together, posted endless photos on social media, and spent countless hours at each other's homes. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect teenage trio. But beneath the surface, tension had been building. Shelia and Rachel had grown close, leaving Skylar feeling like an outsider in her own friend group. According to investigators, she had become a target of their resentment, with the other two girls deciding the only way to remove her from their lives was to kill her. On that summer night, Shelia and Rachel invited Skylar to sneak out with them. Skylar agreed, not knowing she was walking into a trap. The three drove into a remote area just across the Pennsylvania state line. They got out of the car, walked into the woods, and then, in a chilling moment of betrayal, Shelia and Rachel counted to 3. At that signal, they pulled out knives and began stabbing Skylar. The attack was brutal, and Skylar fought hard, but she was outnumbered. Afterward, the girls tried to bury her body, but the ground was too hard. They ended up covering her with branches and dirt before driving away. When Skylar's parents woke the next morning and discovered she hadn't come home, panic set in. Surveillance footage later showed her sneaking out of the house, but nothing beyond that. Police initially suspected she had run away, but her parents insisted otherwise. Weeks turned into months as the search widened. Posters with Skylar's face appeared across the state, and news coverage intensified. Still, no answers came. Meanwhile, Shelia Eddy continued posting on social media, even tweeting about missing her best friend. She played the part of the grieving teenager, going so far as to comfort Skylar's parents during the investigation. Rachel Shoaf, however, began to crack under the weight of guilt. In December 2012, 5 months after the murder, Rachel suffered a breakdown and was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Shortly afterward, she confessed everything to police. Her confession shocked investigators. She told them how she and Shelia had lured Skylar out, taken her across state lines, and carried out the attack. In January 2013, Rachel led police to the site of the body. There, they recovered Skylar's remains, finally giving her parents the heartbreaking closure they had feared. The legal process moved quickly once the truth came out. Rachel Shoaf agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a plea deal. She pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. Shelia Eddy, who had shown no remorse and continued to deny involvement until overwhelming evidence forced her hand, went to trial. In 2014, she pled guilty to first-degree murder and received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentencing brought some justice, but for Skylar's parents, no punishment could undo their loss. They channeled their grief into advocacy, pushing for changes in the law. West Virginia eventually passed Skylar's Law, which made it mandatory for Amber Alerts to be issued even if authorities believe a child is a runaway. The law was a direct response to the shortcomings in how Skylar's disappearance was initially handled. Public reaction to the case was one of outrage and disbelief. The idea that 2 teenage girls could turn on their best friend in such a calculated way horrified communities across the country. Media outlets described it as a real-life cautionary tale of betrayal, where friendship gave way to jealousy and cruelty. The story spread far beyond West Virginia, making headlines nationwide and fueling documentaries, books, and countless discussions online. Today, both Rachel and Shelia remain in prison, serving their sentences as young adults who threw away their futures at the age of 16. Skylar's memory lives on through her parents' advocacy, her friends who remained loyal, and the laws created in her name. This case leaves behind one of the most chilling reflections in modern true crime: that sometimes the greatest danger to a teenager isn't a stranger lurking in the shadows, but the people they trust most, Skylar's death forces us to confront the unsettling truth that betrayal can come from inside the circle of friendship, and that jealousy and exclusion, left unchecked, can have devastating consequences. Number 5. T. Wimberly. It was a normal school day in November 2008 at Dillard High School in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Students filled the halls, teachers prepared their lessons, and the rhythm of daily life carried on as usual. But within minutes, everything would change. A single gunshot would echo through the building, leaving one student dead and another standing there with the weapon in her hand. At the center of it all was 15-year-old T. Wimberly. Tia grew up in Fort Lauderdale and was known by classmates as outgoing, athletic, and always surrounded by friends. She was a bright student who had joined the school's marching band, where she developed a close bond with another student, Amanda Collette. The two were inseparable for a time, spending hours together both inside and outside of school. But as they got older, their friendship became complicated. T reportedly developed romantic feelings for Amanda, while Amanda wanted to keep the relationship strictly platonic. What had once been a deep friendship slowly turned into a source of tension and heartbreak. On November 12, 2008, T arrived at school carrying her mother's handgun, which she had secretly taken from home. She later said that her emotions had been boiling for weeks, fueled by jealousy, rejection, and the fear of losing her closest friend. That morning, during a passing period between classes, she confronted Amanda in the hallway. Witnesses said the exchange was brief and quiet, but then Tia pulled out the gun and fired. Amanda collapsed, fatally wounded. Panic spread instantly through the school as students ran and teachers locked down their classrooms. T did not run. Instead, she left the school and called 911, admitting what she had done. Police found her nearby and arrested her without incident. Her calm surrender stunned officers who had been preparing for a potential chase. The community of Fort Lauderdale was devastated. Amanda Collette was just 15, described as smart, kind, and full of potential. Vigils were held, and classmates struggled to make sense of how a friendship had ended in such violence. The case quickly gained national media attention, with headlines focusing on the dynamics between the two girls and the fact that the crime took place inside a school. The legal process moved swiftly. Because of her age, Tia's case drew immediate debate about whether she should be tried as a juvenile or as an adult. Prosecutors argued that the seriousness of the crime left no choice but to move her into adult court. In 2009, she was formally charged with first-degree murder. During court hearings, T appeared visibly emotional, often in tears as she listened to testimony about Amanda's death. Her defense attorneys argued that she was overwhelmed by emotion, a troubled teenager who made a terrible decision in a moment of rage and confusion. They stressed her lack of criminal history and her willingness to surrender immediately after the shooting. But prosecutors emphasized the planning that went into the crime. T had stolen the weapon from her home, carried it into school, and confronted Amanda with the intent to use it. They argued that this was not a random act, but a deliberate one. The jury agreed with the prosecution's view. In July 2009, Tia Wimberly was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation. Because she was so young at the time of the crime, she was placed in a correctional facility for youthful offenders before being moved into the adult prison system. The sentencing brought mixed reactions. Some in the community felt that justice had been served for Amanda and her family. Others argued that Tia's youth and the emotional complexity of the situation should have been considered more heavily. The case became another example in the ongoing debate over how the justice system should handle juveniles who commit serious crimes. Even years later, the fallout remained. Teachers and students at Dillard High School said the atmosphere of the school was forever changed. Amanda's classmates graduated without her, carrying the memory of that day with them. Meanwhile, Tia, once seen as a promising young student, now faced decades behind bars. The story of T. Wimberly is a tragic reminder of how quickly emotions can spiral out of control, especially in the lives of teenagers still learning how to navigate relationships, rejection, and conflict. A friendship that should have been a source of support instead became the trigger for a devastating act of violence. In the end, 2 lives were destroyed on that November morning: Amanda's, which ended far too soon, and Tia's, which was defined by one irreversible decision. For the community, the case underscored the importance of recognizing warning signs in young people and the devastating consequences when those signs go unnoticed. Number 6. Brenda Spencer. On the morning of January 29, 1979, students at Cleveland Elementary School in San Diego gathered outside before class, just as they did every weekday. Children laughed, played, and waited for the bell to ring. But across the street, in a small house facing the schoolyard, a 16-year-old girl picked up a rifle and began firing out her window. Within moments, 2 adults lay dead. 8 children were injured, and a phrase would be etched into American memory: "I don't like Mondays." Brenda Spencer was the teenager behind the gun. She lived with her father in a modest home directly across from the elementary school. Neighbors described her as quiet and somewhat troubled, a girl who seemed isolated from her peers. Her family life was difficult. Her parents had divorced, and Brenda stayed with her father, who struggled to provide stability. For Christmas just a month earlier, he had given her an unusual gift for a teenager: a .22 caliber rifle with a scope and 500 rounds of ammunition. On that January morning, Brenda positioned herself at the window of her home as children gathered outside for school. Without warning, she opened fire. The first to be hit were the principal, Burton Ragg, and custodian, Mike Suker, who bravely rushed to protect the children. Both men died at the scene. 8 children and a responding police officer were also struck, though they survived. Chaos swept through the schoolyard as teachers pulled students to safety and law enforcement scrambled to respond. The standoff lasted for hours. Brenda refused to come out of her home, speaking to police negotiators by phone. At one point, when asked why she was doing this, she gave the infamous reply, "I don't like Mondays." This livens up the day the phrase would later be repeated across news outlets worldwide, shocking the public with its casual cruelty. Eventually, after nearly 7 hours, Brenda surrendered. She was taken into custody without further violence. Inside her home, investigators found the rifle and spent shell casings scattered across the floor. The legal process was swift and decisive. Despite being just 16, Brenda was charged as an adult with 2 counts of murder and multiple counts of assault with a deadly weapon. In 1980, she pled guilty to the charges, avoiding a lengthy trial. The court sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Brenda's case became one of the earliest and most infamous examples of a school shooting in the United States. The senselessness of the act left the community devastated. Families of the victims struggled to process how a teenager could inflict such violence on children and the adults who protected them. Media outlets across the globe covered the story, often focusing on Brenda's chilling remark, which quickly became a symbol of apathy and nihilism in youth crime. In prison, Brenda has maintained a complex presence. Over the years, she has applied for parole multiple times, but has always been denied. At parole hearings, she has at times expressed remorse, but she has also shifted blame to her difficult upbringing, claiming abuse and neglect by her father. Officials have consistently ruled that she remains a danger to society, citing her lack of consistent accountability for her actions. The cultural fallout from the case has been lasting. The Irish rock band, the Boomtown Rats, even wrote a song inspired by her comment, further embedding the phrase, "I don't like Mondays" into public consciousness. For decades, Brenda Spencer's name has resurfaced whenever discussions about school shootings, youth violence, or gun access arise. Today, she remains in prison in California, now in her 60s, still serving her life sentence. She is eligible to apply for parole again in the coming years, though it is uncertain whether she will ever be released. Looking back, Brenda Spencer's actions marked an early warning of a crisis that would only grow in the decades to follow: violence erupting in American schools. At the time, it seemed unthinkable that a teenager could open fire on children with such detachment. Now, her case is remembered as one of the first high-profile school shootings in U.S. history, one that foreshadowed tragedies still to come. In the end, the story of Brenda Spencer forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about youth, violence, and access to weapons. It asks a question that still echoes today. How can someone so young, with her whole life ahead, turn her window into a sniper's nest against innocent children? Number 7. Catherine and Curtis Jones. In January of 1999, Brevard County, Florida, became the center of a case unlike anything the country had seen before. Two siblings, just 12 and 13 years old, were charged with taking a life, becoming the youngest children in U.S. history convicted of murder. Their names were Catherine and Curtis Jones, and their story was rooted not in mischief or rebellion, but in years of fear, hardship, and desperation that finally came to a breaking point. The Jones children were raised in a troubled household. Their father, Curtis Sr., was known for being strict, and their stepmother, Sonia Spites, often had tense relationships with them. Later, Catherine would claim that she and her brother endured mistreatment from a relative and felt trapped in an environment where their concerns went unheard. Teachers and neighbors noticed signs: long absences, withdrawn behavior. But no one grasped the full reality. By early 1999, the siblings had lost faith that any adult would intervene. They believed their situation would never change, and in their young minds, they came to a tragic conclusion. Catherine, just 12, and Curtis, 13, began discussing a plan that they thought would end their suffering. Their focus turned toward their stepmother, whom they blamed for allowing the situation to continue. On January 6, 1999, while their father was away, they acted on that plan. Curtis accessed a firearm from inside the home, and Sonia was fatally shot. Catherine stood nearby, aware of what was unfolding. In the hours that followed, the children ran into nearby woods, frightened and unsure of what to do next. The community was stunned. News spread rapidly. Two children, barely teenagers, had taken a life. The case drew national attention, with cameras swarming the courthouse and questions being raised about how such young offenders should be handled. The justice system now faced an extraordinary dilemma. Should Catherine and Curtis be tried as children or in adult court? Prosecutors chose the latter, sparking debate nationwide. Many argued that children so young could not comprehend the lifelong consequences of their actions and should be guided through rehabilitation. Others believed that the seriousness of the crime demanded full accountability. In the end, both siblings accepted plea deals. They pled guilty to second-degree murder, avoiding a trial. In 1999, they were each sentenced to 18 years in prison, followed by probation for life. For children who should have been in middle school, the sentence was staggering. Their story became a national conversation about youth, trauma, and the limits of the justice system when dealing with children who commit the most serious of crimes. Life in prison was difficult. Both siblings grew up inside the correctional system, navigating adolescence and adulthood behind walls. Catherine earned a GED and took part in rehabilitation programs. Curtis did the same, working to build some kind of life for himself in confinement. By the time they were released in 2015, they were adults in their early 30s, stepping into a world that had changed completely since their childhood. The fallout from the case lingered long after their release. Advocates for juvenile justice reform often cite Catherine and Curtis as an example of why sentencing laws for children must consider trauma and the potential for rehabilitation. Their story also underscored the failures of systems meant to protect vulnerable kids. If their claims of abuse had been properly addressed, many argue, the killing might never have happened. Today, both siblings live under strict probation, barred from contact with one another unless granted special permission by the court. They have expressed remorse for their actions and have spoken about their hopes of building quiet, productive lives. But they remain forever tied to their crime, remembered as the youngest children ever convicted of murder in the United States. The story of Catherine and Curtis Jones is not like many other true crime cases. It is a haunting mix of guilt and tragedy, where the line between victim and perpetrator blurs. It forces us to ask whether children who commit violence out of desperation deserve punishment, rehabilitation, or some measure of both. And it leaves us with the image of two children, barely teenagers, whose cries for help were drowned out until it was too late. Number 8. Tylar Witt. In June of 2009, the quiet community of El Dorado Hills, California, was rocked by the loss of 47-year-old Joanne Witt. Joanne was a respected software engineer and a devoted single mother, admired for her dedication to both her work and her daughter. But inside her home, tension had been building between Joanne and 14-year-old Tylar. That tension, fueled by a relationship Joanne strongly disapproved of, escalated until it reached a devastating breaking point. Tylar had grown up creative and musically talented, but as she entered her teenage years, she clashed often with her mother's rules. The conflict grew sharper when Tylar began dating 19-year-old Stephen Culver. Joanne, concerned by the age gap and worried about her daughter's well-being, reported Culver to authorities. Prosecutors prepared charges against him, convinced that Joanne was acting to protect her child. Tylar, however, believed she was in love, and her mother's actions felt like betrayal. By the spring of 2009, Tylar and Stephen began imagining a future together without Joanne's restrictions. Their conversations, once filled with teenage fantasies, took on a darker tone. They started to see Joanne not just as a parent enforcing boundaries, but as the obstacle standing in the way of the life they wanted. On the night of June 12th, 2009, events came to a tragic conclusion. Joanne went to bed unaware that plans had been made against her. Later that night, Stephen entered her room, and Joanne lost her life. Tylar was complicit in the plan, though she did not carry out the act herself. Investigators would later find her journal, where she expressed anger toward her mother and described her belief that the relationship could only continue if Joanne were no longer in the picture. The next morning, Joanne's absence at work raised alarms. Concerned colleagues contacted authorities, who went to her home and discovered what had happened. Almost immediately, suspicion fell on Tylar and Stephen, who had already fled. They were located the following day at a hotel near San Francisco and taken into custody. The case shocked the nation. A 14-year-old girl connected to the death of her own mother, all for the sake of an older boyfriend, was almost beyond comprehension. The courtroom quickly filled with reporters as the legal process began. Because of her age, Tylar's case was complicated. She was far too young for a standard adult trial, yet prosecutors argued that the seriousness of her role demanded accountability. In 2011, Tylar accepted a plea deal, admitting her part and testifying against Stephen in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony showed how deeply entangled the two had become, and how the idea of removing Joanne had been discussed between them. Stephen Culver was ultimately convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Tyler pled guilty to second-degree murder. Because she cooperated with prosecutors, she received a sentence of 15 years to life. At just 16 years old, she entered California's prison system as one of its youngest inmates. The public reaction was deeply divided. Many believed Tyler had been a manipulative teenager who betrayed her mother out of selfishness. Others saw her as a vulnerable girl drawn into a destructive situation by someone older. Her story remains a cautionary example of how quickly control, manipulation, and misplaced love can spiral into irreversible consequences. As the years have passed, Tyler Witt has remained in prison. Now in her late 20s, she has become eligible for parole hearings, though whether she will ever be released remains uncertain. Joanne's friends and family continue to oppose her release, arguing that the severity of the crime deserves permanent accountability. The case of Tyler Witt stands as one of the most chilling examples of how adolescent rebellion, when combined with toxic influence, can turn deadly. It is the story of a teenager who believed she was fighting for love, only to destroy the person who loved her most. And it leaves behind a sobering lesson, that the line between ordinary teenage conflict and tragedy can be crossed in a single, irreversible night. Number 9. Sarah Johnson. In the early morning hours of September 2, 2003, the quiet town of Bellevue, Idaho, was rocked by the news that Alan and Diane Johnson, a well-respected couple, had been found dead inside their own home. The killer wasn't a burglar or an intruder. Instead, suspicion quickly turned toward someone inside the family, their 16-year-old daughter, Sarah Johnson. What began as a tragedy soon became one of the most shocking cases of parricide in modern U.S. history. Sarah Johnson was a typical teenager in many respects. She attended Wood River High School, loved cheerleading, and dreamed of leaving her small town behind. But her relationship with her parents had become strained. Alan, a successful foreman, and Diane, a caring mother, disapproved of Sarah's older boyfriend, Bruno Santos, who was 19 and had a history of trouble with the law. They believed he was a bad influence, and they forbade their daughter from seeing him. To Sarah, this wasn't just a rule. It was the ultimate act of control. On that September morning, events inside the Johnson home escalated into violence. At around 6:20 a.m., Alan and Diane were shot with a high-powered rifle while they slept in their bedroom. Alan was struck first, followed by Diane, who investigators said had no time to react. Within minutes, both were dead. The weapon used was one of Alan's own rifles, kept in the family's garage. Sarah, who was home at the time, ran to a neighbor's house shortly afterward, crying that something terrible had happened. Police arrived quickly and found the grisly scene. At first, the thought of a 16-year-old girl committing such an act seemed impossible. Detectives considered other suspects, including intruders or even gang retaliation tied to Bruno. But as evidence mounted, Sarah's story began to unravel. Investigators discovered that Sarah's DNA was on the bathrobe used during the killings. Gunshot residue was also found on her clothing. The rifle, though normally stored in the garage, had clearly been fired from inside the home. Prosecutors argued that Sarah had taken her father's gun, put on a bathrobe to shield herself from the spray, and carried out the attack before staging her discovery of the bodies. The motive was clear in their eyes: her parents' refusal to let her continue seeing Bruno Santos. Witnesses testified that Sarah was deeply infatuated with him and had been furious over her parents' attempts to separate them. For investigators, it was a textbook example of a teenager driven by defiance and obsession. The trial began in 2005 and drew national media coverage. Reporters filled the courtroom as prosecutors laid out their case. They described Sarah as a manipulative teenager who valued her forbidden romance over the lives of her parents. The defense painted a different picture: arguing that Sarah was being scapegoated and that investigators had overlooked other potential suspects. They emphasized her age, her lack of a criminal record, and the absence of any eyewitnesses linking her directly to the shootings. But the forensic evidence was damning. Combined with her inconsistent statements and her continued defiance about her relationship with Bruno, the jury was convinced of her guilt. In March 2005, Sarah Johnson was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring she would spend the rest of her life in prison. The fallout from the case was enormous. In Bellevue, a town of just a few thousand people, residents struggled to comprehend how a girl from such a well-regarded family could kill her own parents. Friends of the Johnsons spoke of their kindness and generosity, mourning not only their loss, but the betrayal that had come from within their own household. Nationally, the story sparked debates about teenage psychology, parental control, and how far a young person might go when they feel their independence is threatened. Some argued that Sarah's punishment was too severe given her age, while others believed that the brutality of the crime warranted nothing less than permanent imprisonment. In prison, Sarah has continued to maintain her innocence, claiming she did not kill her parents. Her appeals have been repeatedly denied, and courts have upheld her sentence each time. Now in her mid-30s, she remains behind bars in Idaho, one of the youngest women in the state to ever receive a life without parole sentence. The story of Sarah Johnson is a stark reminder of how quickly teenage rebellion can spiral into something irreversible. A conflict over a relationship, something many parents and children fight about, ended with the destruction of an entire family. It is a case that forces us to confront unsettling questions. What drives a teenager to see her parents as enemies? And how do you reconcile the image of a high school cheerleader with the reality of a life sentence for double homicide? Number 10. Barry Loukaitis. On February 2nd, 1996, in the small farming town of Moses Lake, Washington, the tranquility of Frontier Middle School was shattered by gunfire. At just 14 years old, Barry Loukaitis walked into his algebra classroom armed with a rifle and 2 handguns. Within minutes, a teacher and 2 students were dead, and another was seriously injured. It was one of the earliest modern school shootings in the United States, and it left a lasting mark on the community and the nation. Barry Loukaitis wasn't an ordinary teenager, at least not in the eyes of classmates. He was often described as quiet, intelligent, and somewhat withdrawn. But beneath the surface, Barry carried deep frustrations. He struggled with depression and anger, and he became fascinated with violent themes in media. He read books like Stephen King's Rage, which depicted a school shooting, and frequently talked about death and revenge. While many dismissed his comments as dark humor, they later proved to be signs of something more dangerous. Barry's family life also showed signs of instability. His parents were in the middle of a bitter separation, and his mother, Joanne, confided troubling thoughts of suicide to him. For a boy already struggling to process his emotions, the tension at home only added to his sense of isolation. Barry's resentment toward the world grew until he decided to take action in a way no one expected. On that Friday afternoon, Barry dressed in a black duster coat and walked into his school carrying a rifle concealed under his clothing. He entered his algebra class just as the lesson was beginning. Without warning, he raised the weapon and opened fire. His teacher, Leona Kairos, was killed instantly, along with 2 students, Manuel Vela and Arnold Fritz. Another student, Natalie Hintz, was badly injured but survived. The scene inside the classroom was chaotic. Dozens of students dove for cover, screaming and crying as Barry continued to point his weapon. It was at that moment that a teacher from a nearby classroom, John Lane, made a split-second decision that saved lives. Lane entered the room, tackled Barry, and managed to wrestle the rifle away from him. Other staff and students helped subdue Barry until police arrived. Thanks to Lane's bravery, further loss of life was prevented. The investigation quickly revealed that Barry had planned the attack in advance. Police found writings that hinted at his intentions, as well as evidence that he had carefully chosen the weapons and timing of the assault. Prosecutors charged him with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Because Barry was only 14, questions arose about whether he should be tried as a juvenile or an adult. Given the gravity of the crime, the court ruled that he would face adult charges. His trial began in 1997 and drew national attention. The defense argued that Barry suffered from mental illness and was influenced by violent books and media. They claimed he did not fully understand the consequences of his actions. The prosecution countered that the planning and execution showed clear intent. The jury sided with the prosecution. Barry Loukaitis was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 205 years without the possibility of parole. At just 16 years old, he was sent to prison for the rest of his life. The public reaction to the case was intense. Moses Lake, a close-knit town, struggled to heal. Memorials were held for the victims, and tributes poured in for John Lane, the teacher whose courage stopped the rampage. The case also sparked national debate about the influence of violent media, mental health in teenagers, and the warning signs that are often overlooked before tragedies occur. Over the years, Barry has remained in prison. From time to time, he has spoken publicly about his actions, often expressing regret and acknowledging the pain he caused to his classmates, their families, and the wider community. Whether those words have offered any sense of closure is difficult to measure. For many, the consequences of that day can never be undone. His case continues to be cited in legal and academic discussions about juvenile crime, touching on the difficult question of how society should sentence teenagers who commit adult-level violence. Should they be treated as children in need of rehabilitation, or as adults who must face the full weight of the law? Barry's story sits at the center of that debate. Nearly 3 decades later, the memory of what happened in Moses Lake has not faded. Survivors still live with the lasting impact of that day. Some carry physical scars, others emotional ones that are harder to see but no less real. Families of the victims continue to feel the void left behind, their lives permanently altered. Teachers, parents, and classmates who were there describe how the sense of safety they once felt in school was shattered forever. The case also serves as a historical marker in America's long struggle with school violence. Occurring in the mid-1990s, it predates many of the tragedies that later dominated national headlines, yet it raised the very same questions that still haunt the country today. How can such events be prevented? What warning signs are missed? And how should justice respond when the perpetrator is a child? The story of Barry Loukaitis is a reminder of the fragility of safety in places we assume are secure, like classrooms. It underscores how quickly a sense of normalcy can be replaced by fear and grief. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it forces us to confront a reality that communities still grapple with. Sometimes the greatest threat does not come from outside intruders, but from someone who had once been part of the very same community. A student sitting quietly at a desk until the moment everything changed. When we look back at these 10 cases, one thing becomes clear. The capacity for violence isn't confined to hardened criminals or adults with long records. Sometimes, it emerges in teenagers, children still in school, who for reasons ranging from jealousy to desperation to delusion, made choices that changed lives forever. From Clare Miller in Pennsylvania to Barry Loukaitis in Washington, these stories span decades, states, and circumstances. Some were driven by obsession, others by anger, mental illness, or trauma. But every case left behind families destroyed, communities shocked, and questions about how society should treat young offenders who commit such adult crimes. Should they face the full weight of the law, or is there room for rehabilitation? It's a debate that continues every time a new case surfaces. What unites them all is the reminder that behind every headline is a victim whose life was cut short, parents and siblings who never heal, and young perpetrators who traded their futures for irreversible decisions. These stories are not just about crime. They are about the fragile line between adolescence and tragedy. If you found this documentary eye-opening, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories, and let us know in the comments which case shocked you the most. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.